Welcome to Spooky Pasta, the place where nightmares come to life. Before we start today's story, let me know in the comments what you guys like to hear, and I'll cover the stories you guys want to listen to. I mean, if I'm just throwing these videos out there, and those topics aren't the ones you'd be interested in, then what's the point for me to narrate those stories in the first place? So please leave a comment about what kind of stories you're interested in. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into our story. Something horrible happened to me at a Scouts trip when I was 8. I Intend to Find Answers by Darren Maloney. When I was 8, I went on a camping trip with my Scouts group to some mountains in Offaly County, Ireland. The plan was to be dropped off by bus, hike through the mountains, and set up camp at a wooden cabin. A straightforward plan, with the promise of good food and stories awaiting us. If only things had turned out as planned. If only I went home with the kind of story that I wouldn't have wanted to hide for 22 years. It has taken me that long to finally tell the story of what happened to me there. The memories had been buried in the back of my mind for so long, lost to the fog and trees of those black mountain valleys. We arrived at the car park, all chatter and excitement, having been cooped up on the bus for the past few hours. As relieved as I was to stretch my legs, the prospect of the trip ahead of me filled me with dread. See, I wasn't the kind to be drawn to trips like this, nor was I even drawn to the Scouts to begin with. My parents had pushed me to join, in a bid to get me out of my comfort zone and hopefully shake off the incessant anxiety that plagued me ever since I had moved school. I was quiet, my humor offbeat, and my interests unusual, at least by the standards of my classmates. They were unusual enough for me to be ostracized most of the time. All I wanted was to talk about horror movies and video games, while my classmates wanted to talk about hurling and football. I wasn't even that different from them. I just liked things they didn't. Those differences, it seemed, were more than enough to justify years of wordless rejection, dirty looks, and poorly hidden smirks when I so much as opened my mouth. It didn't help my sense of dread that my most overt enemy was present on the trip. Jake Kerrigan, the class clown, running his mouth and dragging everyone's attention to him as usual. And of course, the only one who could keep him in line was his father, the camp counselor. Counselor Kerrigan was a kind man, to be fair, attentive and soft-spoken, doting on Jake and his younger sister Breda. I had thought of telling him of how his son was treating me, but I struggled to speak to anyone, let alone to make a complaint, and one about their own son at that. With my one and only friend in the class being absent for the trip with stomach bug, I resorted to my tried and true tactic of turtling up, keeping quiet, and getting on with things while being as small a target as possible. We were greeted by Counselor Murphy from the Offaly Scouts, who knew the area well and was due to lead us to the cabin. She called us to gather together and do an inventory check and go over some rules before setting out. As we grouped together, a sudden pang of foul odor struck me. It was hard to describe the odor, but an image sprung to mind of a dead fox I had seen on a country road, decay wafting into the air heated by the sun-cooked tarmac. "Smell that fresh country air," Counselor Murphy said with a bubbly clap of her hands. "Lots of animals around here, so don't mind the smell, you'll get used to it in no time. Now if you stick together and follow me and Counselor Kerrigan, we'll be at the cabin in around 45 minutes. Last one there has to set up the bonfire." I'll be last, so, I thought. I'll be glad for something to do. As we walked, I took in my surroundings. Huge dark trees blanketed the mountains, running deep and dark as far as I could see. We had only been walking for 10 minutes, and already I felt as if I were traipsing into a different world. It would have been the perfect escape from my dreadful day-to-day, had it not been for the bad company. That and the smell. I kept smelling it, and every time I did, I was filled with a horrible feeling that something bad would happen. I was no stranger to this feeling, being the anxious child that I was. I'm sure many can relate to that implacable feeling of dread that something bad will happen soon, though it rarely ever does. This feeling was different. It was more of a certainty, rooted into the pit in my stomach as surely as these woods were rooted into the mountains. Something felt wrong, and sure as hell smelled wrong. Where before I just felt dread, I was now genuinely afraid. Instinct urged me to feign sickness, to ask to turn back while there was still time and retreat to the sanctuary of home. And like I always did when afraid, I kept my mouth shut and marched ever onward. We arrived within the hour, though it felt like much longer. In between watching the trees and fighting my horrible fear, I was of course tormented by Jake whenever his attention span lingered on me long enough for him to remember I exist. I was sure to linger behind, but to no avail. Some of the louder kids wanted to help build the bonfire and quickly set about doing so. I had either been forgotten to be recruited to build it, or was never noticed at all. Either suited me fine. I set up my sleeping bag in the most inconspicuous corner of the cabin that I could find. The rest of the day passed in a cold, dull blur. The air was bitingly cold, still and silent save for the ambient buzz of all present. I reckon I would have enjoyed the trip if I had good company, someone I could be comfortable around and enjoy myself in the nature with. But knowing what I went through next, I'm just glad my real friends weren't with me. I lingered on the periphery of the group, keeping to myself and daydreaming in a bid to pass the time quicker. Every now and then, I felt watched. I looked up, expecting to see Jake prepare some sly remark or stupid joke. As I looked around me, I would inevitably see Counselor Murphy watching me with a wide grin on her face. I was used to feeling invisible. Being watched by her made me uneasy for some reason. Logically, I knew that having an adult look out for me and wanting me to be at ease must surely be a good thing. But her smile just seemed off somehow. I was conflicted between unease and appreciation at the fact that I actually felt seen for once. As night fell, excitement began to build for the imminent bonfire. The kindling ignited as the last of the sun faded beyond the trees and gloom, and the world was painted blue and orange. It was my hope that ghost stories would be told. What kind of scout counselors would have a bonfire and not tell at least one? To my dismay, they performed an improv comedy act about, of all things, a football match. Even here, I could not escape the sports-centric mediocrity of my school. They soon disbanded. A hike through the dark woods had been planned after the bonfire. All decided to go, except for me. My parents saw fit to equip me only with an old bulb flashlight, the battery of which was almost dead. Dying along with it was my social battery, so if staying behind allowed me even half an hour to myself, I would take it. Counselor Kerrigan took the group, while Counselor Murphy stayed behind. As I resigned myself to moping indoors, wishing I was home playing video games, Counselor Murphy approached me. God, that bonfire was shocking, wasn't it? Not even a single ghost story. Never thought I'd see the like. I gave a meek laugh in response, wholeheartedly agreeing but not having the confidence to carry the conversation. Would you have liked one yourself? She asked, seeking to bring me out of my shell. Yeah, I stammered. Well, I happen to know a place just up the road that makes for a great spot to tell a ghost story. How about we go tell one before everyone gets back? I'll bring the marshmallows and hot chocolate. I didn't really want to go, but the idea of having at least some reprieve from the monotony with something I genuinely enjoyed enticed me. That, and food was one of the few comforts I had back then. An adult who was supposed to protect me offering me food and a good ghost story? I should have known it was too nice. We walked up the road we had arrived from earlier, a steep incline covered in sharp stones, leading up to the tree line. Out here, away from the dying light of the bonfire. It was almost complete blackness. I expected to hear the distant laughs of the group, but all was silent except for the sound of my breathing as we ascended. We walked into the woods, avoiding boggy puddles of muck. My light barely illuminated the best way forward, but Counselor Murphy's LED lantern cast enough light to guide us properly. We arrived at a small clearing. I expected some sort of organized space, log benches or a campfire or something, but all I saw was a bare clearing with some rocks that barely passed for seating. Counselor Murphy sat and invitingly patted a rock as if it were the height of luxury, with a wide grin on her face. Her face was illuminated from a low angle by the pale blue light of the lantern, and her smile sent chills down my back more than the bitter winter night air did. It was even more off-putting up close. She handed me a pack of marshmallows and a thermos of hot chocolate. I dropped some marshmallows into the thermos and sat down, unnerved but excited. I took a deep breath. Cold alpine air, winter fresh, mixed with steaming hot chocolate and that fucking awful smell from earlier. I gagged, my appetite dissipating with the thermos's steam in the night air. It was worse than earlier, permeating the air like rancid meat on a summer's day. My memories of the time aren't perfect. Most of what I'm telling you now passed by in a sort of half-remembered blur, with certain moments holding it all together. For that reason, I can't fully recall the story she told. It didn't matter anyway, as it was all just a lure. I wasn't to be told a ghost story. I was in one. As she told the story of unmapped caves, missing children and mound people, her eyes never faltered once. I don't recall her blinking, nor dropping that damnable smile once. The smell only got worse as she spoke. I tried to cover my nose, but it made little difference. The lantern she had set down on a rock had begun to fade. I only noticed as it happened so subtly. My eyes had had time to adjust, like being in a room as the sun sets. I had noticed too late. The light went out. I recall the next moments the most vividly, though they pass in a blur. A brief few seconds of silence, blackness, and nauseating stink. I remember the faintest wisp of white in the blackness as my hyperventilated breath tumbled forth in a waft of fog. I fumbled for my flashlight, true fear and freezing cold numbing my hands and clouding my sensibilities far worse than any of my beloved horror movies could ever have prepared me for. My thumb found the button on my light. My light turned on, and there, illuminated in flickering yellow light, stood something that wasn't Counselor Murphy anymore. A sinuous body of pale, undulating flesh, caked with forest soil. Ragged black hair curtaining teeth as rotten as tree pith and just as old. Too many fingers. Too many joints. The stink of something fermented in the bowels of the earth and expelled for being too fetid. My body took over, instinct sending my legs pumping where fear and innocence would have me remain rooted to the spot. I recall warm breath on my ear and the snap of teeth. Agonized moans, as if the thing's very existence weighed painfully on its too numerous joints. In my panic to escape, I forgot the puddles of muck near the tree line. My foot plunged into one. Sinking deep, I was ensnared, tugging desperately as the thuds of misshapen hands and feet drew closer. I pulled forth my foot, leaving my shoe submerged. I managed to tumble down the mucky slope onto the road, stray thorns and bramble cutting at my palms and face. Sharp stones stung my exposed foot as I ran to the cabin, though I cared little with sanctuary in sight. A light of hope shone through the trees, lots of them. The scout group had returned from their hike. I screamed, trying to call their names but managing only incoherent crying and wailing. I recall being oddly amused in that moment as I wondered if the voice was mine. The mind will do what it needs to survive, I suppose. Flashlight beams were directed my way, and the skittering steps behind me receded back into the blackness of the trees. Counselor Kerrigan ran to me, a look of confusion quickly eclipsed by true worry and fear as he saw me alone, cut to bits and fearing for my life. He ushered me to the cabin and asked everyone to remain in their dorms. "Go find Counselor Murphy," he told one of the more mature scouts. A response tumbles from my mouth unbidden. "Don't go into the woods." The fear in my words must have been palpable, as Counselor Kerrigan opted instead to have everyone stay indoors while he called the guardai. He tried to reassure me, distracting me with talk of finding my lost shoe when it was bright again. I would have limped home shoeless if it meant never having to go back to those woods again. I don't know how long the guardai took to arrive, but it was long enough for Jake to get restless. I suppose he didn't like the attention not only being on someone else, but being on the quietest reject in the school to boot. He began clowning around, asking the guardai obnoxious questions and generally being an insensitive, interfering fool. He got nasty, trying to claim I was trying to make everything about myself, and that I was the one who scared his sister on the hike with that stupid mask. I was in no position to quiz him on what he was talking about, nor speak at all for that matter. I was catatonic, just doing what I could to hold it all together. I do remember his sister Breda looking deeply upset. Her friends gathered around her trying to console her along with her father, leaving me to be picked on by Jake. That is, right up until the moment he leaned out the back window to get a better look at the guardai as they searched the woods for anything pertinent. He leaned out, and as he did, he froze. His mischievous grin faded, his wide eyes seeming not to comprehend what it was he was looking at. Slowly, he sat back down. He sat for a moment, absorbed in thought, a disturbing behavior for him by itself. He then simply ran to the fireplace and vomited. Some of the others asked if he was okay, asking what had happened, but they couldn't get it out of him. Not one word. He just shook his head and seemed to try to block everything out. Needless to say, I never went on another scouting trip. I gave up the scouts soon after, and was treated with a modicum of pity by all at school, and kept at arm's length. Nothing new. Jake was still nasty to me from time to time, but he seemed to always pipe down immediately after. Maybe the thoughts led to him recalling what he had seen at the back of the cabin that night. We never did find out what happened to Counselor Murphy, nor did I learn of what thing masqueraded as her, nor did I have the chance to ask Breda what it was that she had seen on the hike. For 2 decades and then some, I've sought to just move on, to forget it all. But yesterday, I received a message on social media from none other than Jake Kerrigan. He was civil, friendly, and prefaced his message with a meek apology that he assured me would be more formal and comprehensive should we agree to meet in person. I read on, for the unexpected apology if nothing else. I would want to meet him in person, he assured me, once I had heard him out. He referred to what we went through at Scouts and how he wanted answers. For himself, for his sister Breda, and for the hard times he gave me over it unjustly. He had gone so far as to travel to the old cabin, now a molded ruin in the mountains never used by anyone. He had investigated the area, looked for anything out of place that might point him in the right direction. He had been there for scarcely an hour, and resolved to return at a later date to put his old scout skills to the test and explore properly. As he left, he saw something that had sent him speeding away from the area as soon as he could. He sent a picture of what he saw. Chills ran down my spine as I looked at the image, his words of questioning fading away to gibberish as my heart pounded as hard as it did when I ran away from the woods, away from that horrible thing back then. Placed neatly on the doorstep, bloated and covered in bog muck, was my shoe.